Vaporwave, a genre that has been played out in every sense of the word. A genre that has produced both amazing, groundbreaking albums and terrible low-effort cash grabs that go past the level of laughably bad and straight into ear-grating. Though, Vaporwave is one of those genres of music that transcends music itself, and is more well known for its aesthetic and iconography than its actual sound. Not everyone will know what Vaporwave sounds like, but they sure know what it looks like. But among these universally recognized aesthetics lies a key component to the whole thing, and that's nostalgia. But this key component is also its curse. Due to the nature of Vaporwave itself, the genre has developed many highly specific subgenres focusing on conveying extremely specific emotions. With albums made to emulate the feeling of being in a mall, grocery store, watching the news in the 90s, or even corporate music, can all be found in the Vaporwave scene. In fact, it seems many people have made it their MO to seek out these albums to immerse themselves in this experience, looking to fill a void and indulge in hyper-escapism. And that, my friends, is what we're here to talk about. Let's talk about Vaporwave and the curse of nostalgia. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, let's talk about Vaporwave and its origins, because I think context is key to understand how things got to be the way that they are. Vaporwave formed on the fringes of Bandcamp during the early 2010s, with now iconic albums like Macintosh Plus's Floral Shop and Chuck Pearson's Echo Jams, laying the foundation of what Vaporwave would later become. The sound was based on a mixture of sampling and layered effects and synths, creating a washy and warbled soundscape, often using samples from 80s and 90s music as well as retro video games as the main component for each track. This was coupled with the themes Vaporwave explored, being hyper-consumerism, nihilism, and even a critique of late-stage capitalism. The aesthetic of Vaporwave also really sprung from these albums as well, with Echo Jams introducing a retro video game aesthetic, and Floral Shop bringing in the all-too-famous and iconic Greek statue and saturated colors. This is where we see the seeds of nostalgia initially take root in the genre, though they wouldn't yet fully encapsulate it. At least, not yet. The genre would grow and expand in every way, leading to the creation of spin-off genres like Vapor Trap and Future Funk. Albums like Blink Banshee's Zero and Moe Shop's Pure Pure would continue to expand the genres into their own little scenes, with a variety of sounds creating their own subculture inside of the electronic scene. However, whereas within these albums and artists we see how Vaporwave began to evolve into something interesting, something diverse, and something unique, on the other side of the coin is where we can see this hyperfixation on nostalgia and the past begin to devolve into something much less ambitious than what the genre started as. And this is where Malsoft enters the conversation. While it's debatable that Malsoft was created with the intent on becoming a haven of hyper-escapism, it still paved the road to it. The entire idea of Malsoft is to create loungy and easy to listen to music, drenched in reverb that almost replicates the sound of overhead speakers heard inside of a mall. Oftentimes, Malsoft artists will include ambient samples of walking and talking to amplify the crowded mall atmosphere. And while that might sound like a fun concept for an album or two, it spiraled into a large part of the Vaporwave scene. You might think most would casually listen to it out of curiosity to hear something new, but that's not really the case. In fact, even legends in the Vaporwave scene like Pat Chennington and Geometric Lullaby have found themselves entrapped in this curse of nostalgia. Dennis of Geometric Lullaby talked about how he would go to crowded malls and walk around with his headphones on, listening to Malsoft albums to really get the full experience.
I used to go to the Mall of America all the time.
Okay.
I just like have my headphones in. I would go by myself and just walk around. I don't know. It's like a feeling of like being alone, like by yourself, but with so many different people around you.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's a name for that. There might be, but it's like a specific feeling. But yeah.
But for some, like Dennis, who lived in a rural and empty town most of his life, wanting to experience this type of atmosphere is much more understandable, and a look into something he probably didn't experience much. But if you look at the comments, reviews, and other creators from deeply populated places like California and New York, they often express how much they love to listen to these albums and escape into that world of Malsoft. Before we go any further, let me just give you a sampling of what Malsoft sounds like. Not quite the most engaging thing, huh? But for some reason this has entranced hundreds of thousands of eager listeners. And you might be sitting there thinking, why are you talking about this, Madison? People like a weird genre of music. What's wrong with that? And you're right. There isn't anything wrong with enjoying Malsoft. But to be fair, I haven't exactly shown you just how far this rabbit hole goes, so bear with me for a minute, because it only gets more and more esoteric. What if I told you that there was a large group of people who yearned for a simulation of the ambience of a grocery store? You would probably laugh, but I'm not kidding when I say, not only does such an album exist, but it's widely considered a classic of Malsoft. The album is titled Yes, We Are Open, and it's exactly what you think it is. Take the sound of Malsoft, but instead of reverb simulating overhead speakers, it's now reverb simulating crappy ceiling speakers you would hear in a dumpy old grocery store. The sound of Yes, We Are Open is much more loungy and subtle, playing on the repetitious nature of what you would actually hear in such a place. And before you ask, it's just as boring as it sounds, but that doesn't mean I don't understand the appeal. If this at all piques your curiosity, it really is worth listening to, at least once, and so does the genre in general. But outside of that curiosity, these hyper-specific and admittedly gimmick-based productions are worth only that. Yet many find themselves mystified and entranced by this album. So let me just give you a taste, so you might be able to understand what I'm actually talking about here. Absolutely riveting. But snarky comments aside, as a simulation of ambiance, it actually does its job quite well in capturing the atmosphere of an old grocery store, and I do commend the artist for being able to capture that so well. Though outside of that, I can't exactly say much else. The gimmick gets stale by the fourth song. And this isn't because the artist themselves is bad by any means, but it's because the idea and framework that the music is trying to fit doesn't really allow much for variety or experimentation. Although if the music wasn't at least a little boring, would it really fit the mood of mindlessly shopping for everyday items at your local Kroger's? As I mentioned previously, it's hard to find much of an appeal to this genre outside of curiosity or using it as a surrogate for a strange void that lonely people would want to fill. But don't worry, if you think the esoteric train ride is over, we still got a few more stops along the way. Alright, but why are we talking about 9/11? What could Malsoft possibly have to do with George Bush and his Middle Eastern tourist campaign? The simple answer is some madman decided that Malsoft wasn't weird and esoteric enough and felt a news-themed album set during 9/11 was the best choice to spice things up. Not only does this album exist, but just like Yes, We Are Open, it's considered a classic. The album in question is named News at 11 and written by Cat System Corp. The entire record is made up of loungy, smooth jazz songs strung between samples of news clips that aired on 9/11. As edgy as that might sound, the album doesn't really contain any samples referencing the attack, And supposedly it simulates the day that would have gone on if the World Trade Center never got the 1-2 punch from Al Qaeda.
We missed the truck! We're not aiming for the truck!
Only further showing the reaches that Malsoft will go to create atmospheres of escapism, even if the music itself is just boring recycled songs reminiscent of what you would have heard on CNN or Fox during the 90s.
Other than that, it's kind of quiet around the country. We like quiet. It's quiet. It's too quiet.
And all jokes aside, it's the first album that actually kind of pissed me off. While I'm not against the idea of making jokes at the expense of heavy topics, I mean, hell, I just made multiple 9/11 jokes myself. What I am against is taking something as touchy and heavy as 9/11 and slapping it onto a lazy collection of reused songs in a shitty attempt to create interest for a project. If you want to use tragedy for laughs or even try to say something, I think that's great. I would even go as far as to say that it's important to touch on the taboo from time to time, but that doesn't mean I won't find it tasteless and cringe when it's used in a shameless attempt to gain notoriety for clicks, especially if it's a shitty album. Rant aside though, I don't hate Cat System Corp, and he has gone on to put out some interesting music in the years since News at 11, but regardless, this album is just another boring hyper-escapist fantasy that continued to pave the esoteric road Malsoft has gone down. Because yes, this rabbit hole goes even deeper. Something I hinted at with News at 11 is that many of these albums have pseudo-stories attached to them. This is a common thread across nearly all Vaporwave adjacent genres, but it's become almost a necessity for Malsoft, and this album is no exception.
Its sheer size astounds you. A ceiling that seems to reach for miles without end. Glass elevators zoom up and down, silently passing each other. The light pouring through the ceiling inspires you. The music echoing through all 47 floors. Sounds of wonder, new discoveries. Yet the concrete walls make you feel cold and small. You can't help but get the feeling that you're totally alone. This is brutalism, and this is the hotel of the modern age.
This is the accompanying description of Hallmark 87's legendary album, Atrium. And yes, I said legendary. This record has become a bit of an anomaly over the years, breaking out of the Malsoft scene and being recognized by more mainstream audiences. So, besides the semi-alluring description and some cool artwork, what does Atrium do that makes it break the mold? Well, it doesn't rely much on sampling and instead creates mostly original compositions with an emphasis on dreamlike qualities, something that feels as if it would be snug and at home in the ambient genre. But imagine that being absolutely fucking destroyed by reverb that washes away any weight and texture the music once had, all to simulate the tinny, cheap sound of a hotel elevator speaker. Don't believe me? Here, have a listen for yourself. Yeah, way to ruin what otherwise could have been a fairly decent ambient record. But that's the thing, all the music I've referenced as being part of Malsoft does the same thing. It sacrifices musicality for ambiance. And Atrium is no exception to this, which brings me to what I've been building up to this entire video. I'm sure you've noticed I've been repeating the words escapism, hyperspecific, and ambiance much more than any one person should in conversation. This is because that's the entire point. The title isn't clickbait. Hyperescapism is the curse of nostalgia. Something I hope I've conveyed is that Malsoft really isn't music. And I'm not saying that as some angry nerd who wants to shit on something I don't like. Malsoft is unapologetically non-musical and has its focus on creating specific ambiances to synthesize the feelings of whatever the album you're listening to is themed on. This is the entire point, and it's why I brought up that interview with Pat Chennington. Now, this video wasn't made to demonize anyone who enjoys this particular genre, but to rather bring up something that I found a bit startling, and something all of Vaporwave in a way perpetuates. As many people who discovered this music as teenagers have aged, and as the world has continued to spiral into a harder and harder place to exist,
This is fine. I'm okay with the events that are unfolding currently.
more and more people have found themselves victims of their own vices. For some, it's alcohol. For others, it might be food addiction, and for many, it's escapism, whether it be through video games, collecting Funko Pop vinyls, or yes, even listening to Malsoft. So many people have found it easier to hide away in their own hyper-specific fantasy of abandoned malls, grocery stores, and haunted hotels than deal with the reality that lies in front of them. Who needs friends and close relationships when you can escape into an alternate reality? Why not just put up with that underpaying job that makes you die inside when you hear the calming sounds of the grocery store? You get the point. Escapism is a massive problem, and while I could have made an entire video delving into it, I was more interested in just how much of Vaporwave, and especially Malsoft, caters specifically to it. I have yet to see anyone else bring it up, and I think it's something to take note of, because it's much easier to see you have a problem when you lose money to pieces of plastic or see your health diminish due to substance abuse. But if your vice is an ambience that's a little awkward to tell your friends you like to listen to, it's a lot easier to justify it, especially when you're surrounded by hundreds of thousands, if not millions of other people who share your specific vice. In the end, enjoy what you want to enjoy, do so in moderation, and don't fall victim to the escapist vice. And Malsoft is by no means the only player in this issue. The same could be said of OnlyFans, VTubers, vloggers, etc. There are so many vices online that create parasocial and hyper-specific escapist experiences. It's one of the biggest problems we're facing in the modern age, and again, it's not so much that these things are so negative in and of themselves, but it's the way people use them. Though, with all that being said, subscribe, follow me on Twitter, support me on Patreon, and I'll see you in the next video.
It's me, Madison Ray, playing up you pathetic little babe pitties.